class. Today we will wrap up our discussion of evolution with artificial selection and a few other tidbits. We start with pigeons, and yes, these humble rats of the sky present a tremendous example for us of artificial selection that has been happening for thousands of years. There are more breeds of domesticated pigeon than of any other species. There's something like 1,100 across the world. Really, we know that it started in Europe, and there are something in the area of 500 to 600 species that breeds there, but really we can see pigeon breeders in every corner of the globe. And each one of these breeds has a certain characteristic that it has been bred for. In many cases, it's based on appearance, things like the feathers that you see in the variety in the picture shown here, but as well as other things like the ability to hone in on a particular location and fly back to that place, and a variety of other hunting characteristics, and also even things like having larger muscle size, because some of these breeds are also used as sources of food for some cultures. Now, a little bit closer to home, if you remember back to our reading of Omnivore's Dilemma, there's been quite a bit of artificial breeding that has gone into the production of corn, and the ability for corn to be able to have those extra large kernels, for its ability to survive despite drought, for its resistance to certain types of pesticides, and a whole host of other different characteristics have been bred into this particular species solely for our benefit. As we know, that corn is not something that existed in its current form in nature, but it was through selecting individual corn plants that exhibited characteristics that humans liked, being able to breed those plants together to produce then offspring that would continue to have those same favorable characteristics. Now, if you are a farmer repeating that year after year, generation after generation, we see that there's some pretty big changes that happen over the course of hundreds and thousands of years since we've domesticated these variety of species. We know that household pets, dogs and cats, have dozens, hundreds of different breeds, and all of those different breeds have certain characteristics for which humans had selected them. In the case of dogs, the ability to be good hunters, to be able to work with animals, to be able to work, to be able to provide protection for their owners, and many other things that dog breeders might have wanted over the years. Those traits have been bred into each of those different species, and that gives the species both its physical characteristics but also its behavior. Now, we can certainly see that this can be taken to extremes, like the Sphinx hairless cat that you see here, and we can see that certain mutations that can appear, this particular breed of cat with no hair, this is a mutation that has appeared a number of different times in a number of different places around the world, and at some point someone decided it would be a good idea to try to make that into a cat breed. And they were successful by breeding together cats selected out of the population that had that same mutation. They were able to generate a new line of cats that would all inherit that same characteristic of having no hair. One other topic to look at is that of biogeography. In this map you see here, the world is divided into these different zones based on color. Each of those zones contains a set of organisms that has a kind of sister set of organisms in each of the other zones, because what we see is that evolution has occurred simultaneously in each of these different places. And so those species that we find, for example, here in purple in North America, tend to have some similar species down here in Australia. Because they've been separated by geography, those populations have not been able to interbreed and to mix together. However, the environment has pushed them towards having some similarities. So we see the first example here with the sugar glider and the flying squirrel. Two different continents, but you can see the striking similarities between those two different species because both of them have characteristics that are helpful for them to be able to move from tree to tree with greater ease. A few other examples here that you can take a look at. Looking at species on the left are those that would be found in Australia, and species on the right, those that we would find in North America. Okay, moving forward, a couple of other important points to make sure that you're aware of in regards to some examples of evolution. Just like in the past, we learned about antibiotic resistance. Same thing will occur with insecticides. As insecticides are used more and more on plants, on agricultural plants in particular, we see that there's natural variation in the insect species. So those in white would be the insects that are susceptible to insecticide and will be killed by the chemical. Those that are in red are more likely to survive because they have a trait that will allow them to resist the drug's effects. Once the pesticide is added to the leaf, you see most of those insects in white have died off, leaving the one in red. And once those reproduce and are allowed to repopulate, we see that there's now a greater percentage of red or insecticide resistant bugs and less of the white. And that cycle continues, and again, this is a product of natural selection, of how it is that those species that are more suited to their environment and better able to survive will live and reproduce and pass on those traits. Now, this could be lumped in with artificial selection because this is not necessarily a natural environmental condition, but something that humans have imposed on these insects, and so that has really sped up the rate of this particular evolution. Here you can see a chart showing the increase in the number of chemicals which the Colorado potato beetle has been shown to be resistant to, and how the population has shifted over time from having very little resistance back 50, 60 years ago to having a resistance to dozens of different chemicals today. So as the resistance of the insect increases, then the requirement of farmers to have to use a more and more strong and potentially hazardous chemical to still try and kill off that particular beetle, that cycle will increase and continue on year after year. The peppered moth example, another great famous example of natural selection happening in the course of recorded, and particularly in this case, very recent history. And you can see the variation present here on the right in the two types of moths, those with the dark coloration and those with the light coloration. When the environmental conditions are such that the tree is shown like you see here, where it is mostly white, you see that the moth on the right will have a greater protection from predators, and so it will be more likely to survive. During the 1800s, as the industrial era really took hold in England, you see that the dark-colored moth gained an advantage because it was able to blend in with all of the smog and the soot that caked onto those trees. And so the white ones, their populations decreased as the black ones survived, reproduced, and passed on that dark-colored trait. But throughout the history of the moth, both of these existed. They existed simultaneously, but what shifted is really the proportion of them. How much of the population is light-colored versus how much of the population is dark. Again, showing evolution, because evolution is simply the change in species that happens. Now, last couple points here. A few misconceptions to make sure that you don't let fall into your vocabulary and your writing as you think about test time. Number one, not on the screen, but as we've talked about, do not say that species adapted, do not say that individuals adapted. Evolution is not an active process where species are capable of making changes to themselves. Adaptations are things that you inherit. So either you have the adaptation from birth or you do not. Another one here is the idea of a goal-oriented process. Evolution is not something that is creating better and better species necessarily, but ones that are just better suited to the environment at the time. So we can't look at species that are alive today and say that humans and dogs and bacteria and all the things that are around today are at the peak of perfection. Rather, these are just the species that have the characteristics that are necessary for them to survive right now. So change will continue to happen into the future, and it's not a case of better or worse, but rather just different. A great example of that is here on the right. There's a picture in your review book about the different horse species and how horses have evolved over time. And what this shows you, this branches out. The species that are in yellow are those that we see are the descendants, or sorry, the ancestors of all of the current version of the horse that we see in existence today. And in white, this shows you all of the so-called failed branches, those branches of horse species that we find evidence of in the fossil record, but they don't have any living descendants. And so we can see here that it's not as though you had many different species all culminating in the horse, but we have all kinds of branches here that are less successful, and those that lack the proper adaptations to be able to compete and survive in their environment are less likely to survive. Finally, I invite you to take a look at the video here. This is, again, another example of how evolution does not occur, so log on to your Prezi and take a look at that. Thank you.